So we'll start. I always, I know you did the names over here. We could get the other names though. Since you're new for this and Moshe, I'll start with Rick.
I'm Rick. Been here for 3 years. In Philadelphia.
Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
Pittsburgh.
yeah, been out to Pittsburgh, going out to, I was telling the rabbi, I'm going out to Pittsburgh. Next, beginning of August for the Maccabi days.
Oh, another Pennsylvanian.
You will be working with my cousin and best friend, Linda Simon.
Does she live there?
She does live there, but she's very involved in the Maccabi.
Nice. So you'll have
What's her
to,
name?
Linda Simon.
you'll have to look out for that one.
I'll have to look out for that one, because it's not ringing a bell, because I know a lot of people, probably been doing it for 20 years.
All right. I guess you'll introduce Moshe while he puts his eye drop.
Moshe Abraham, and was born in Iran, grew up in Israel, and now he's here.
He's an Arizonan for many years. Iris, you,
Pittsburgh, born in Pittsburgh, went to Michigan State, and now I'm here.
Forgive you on that.
That's fine.
It's all right, I ran track for Penn State, so.
It's a rivalry, you know.
Fine.
Maybe in football. All right, Janie,
Jake is next, Steve.
Jeff, and Joanne is another Pennsylvanian. It's my neck of the woods. I'm in the Madison School District. All right, so I always, I'm sharing this for both of you. Anytime we do a discussion, any question goes. So if you have a question that's been bothering you about Judaism or something you just were curious about, I open up the floor, as they say. And of course, there's always good subjects. This month is Chanukah. So besides for any questions that come up from each of you, we could talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to start, I'll open it up first. If anyone has a question that's been on their mind.
Did you buy me a Hanukkah?
I still have time, no? I was with someone yesterday. They said one guy is the planner and the other guy is the last minute runner. He said it used to be so simple. You ran into the mall, you know, on December 24th. And it's like this. It's like now you have to do Amazon. It's like you need 2 days. But anyways, yeah. I can check, but while I'm checking, here's just an interesting little tidbit of information. There is a year in our calendar that we won't be alive for, that there is no Hanukkah in that year.
What? Oh, it goes in January?
Yeah. So in the year 3031, there's no Hanukkah, and in the year 3032, there are 2 Hanukkahs.
I thought we had that.
Oh, maybe I was only looking forward, but possibly I would have to look back.
Way back.
Well, the lady who told me this, and then I'll come back to answer how it happens. The woman who told me this, she said, I thought she was like talking messianic or something. Like, you know, there's going to be a time when we don't celebrate Hanukkah anymore. And I'm like, that doesn't really make sense because they say that the rabbinic holidays will be celebrated even when we have the messianic era. So like, why would we not be celebrating Hanukkah? So then I realized she meant like literally, I took my calendar and it's like you literally, I can go year by year by year by year, which is how I'll answer your question about or the 24th question. Last time it coincided. But it's basically, so to go back to the answer, who asked about the Christmas question? You did? Okay, so the 25th of Kislev is the Hebrew date of Hanukkah. So this year it begins on the 26th, which is the 25th at night, correct? So if I go back in years, or you want me to go forward in years? When's the next time? Or when was the last time? Okay. The last time that happened. First of all, in 2019, it began December 22nd. And in 2016, it began exactly like this on the 25th, meaning the night before. But coming up, let's say, the next time this happens is 2027, exact date. So
Oh,
just it'll start again on a Christmas Eve. I don't know what day of that will be a Saturday though. So we'll be lighting our first candle on a Friday night. Now, interestingly enough, my wife told me that Hanukkah never begins on Tuesday.
because.
So, and this is where I'm coming back to your question. And I didn't look if she meant it doesn't begin on a Tuesday, which means a Monday night lighting, or I didn't check that with her. But basically, this is what happened. Our original calendar had nothing to do with the secular calendar. So meaning when you were talking about a Hebrew date on a calendar, the way it worked was every single month, the court in Jerusalem specifically announced that it is a new month. And they would do that based on witnesses, not on calculations, but on witnesses that saw the new moon. So obviously a lunar cycle, because it waxes and wanes, will be 29 to 30 days. That they know. But the question is it the 29th or on the 30th that it's the new month? And so they would wait for witnesses in Jerusalem. And as soon as they would hear that, there was an entire process of how they made sure every single city in Israel and then beyond, because Jewish communities were not just in Israel. And so, but it had to be sanctified in Jerusalem. And so because of that, the process involved messengers, it involved torches from mountaintops. And eventually, though, people started tricking the system. There were two ways that people tricked the system. One way was false witnesses. Two people would come to the court and say, we saw the new moon, and they didn't really. Now, the court didn't just accept a testimony like that, but these people would practice well enough that they knew the questions. They knew where they were going to answer, where they saw the moon. The court, though, the rabbis of the court were very bright rabbis, and they knew the truth about the kind of the calculations of where the moon should be, when it should have a new moon. Now, a new moon means it disappears for a moment and reappears. So as the moon becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, for a moment, there's a disappearance and a reappearance. Now, with that, if two people saw it, they could come to the court, and then the court would interrogate them to a degree to make sure they're not lying. The thing is that if we know that they're lying and they can answer every question so well, you have to go by their testimony. So that was one way that people tricked the system. The other way that people tricked the system was nothing to do with the courts. They would start putting the flares up. They would start waving the torches. And the next town knows it's either today or tomorrow. And they see the torch go up. And so they've raised theirs. And you're going city to city. And people are now celebrating the new month on the incorrect day, which also impacts when holidays are celebrated. And so for that reason, the rabbis eventually fix the calendar, meaning they take all the calculations. They say, here is the new moon. Here is the new moon. Here is the new moon. They can do that with calculations. And so because of that, we have a fixed calendar. Because we have a fixed calendar, they did a couple things to make our lives slightly easier. For example, certain days they made sure to not have a holiday. So Yom Kippur could be on a Saturday, but never on a Saturday night. Correct. That's a great example. So can it be on a Saturday night? I don't think so.
No.
So it can't be on a Thursday night and it won't be on a Saturday night. They made sure that the calendar doesn't line up that way, which means that what will they do? A lunar cycle is not 29 days exact. It's, let's say, 29 and a quarter. So they'll push the day in one of those months to make sure that it didn't line up to those days. Because they do that, there are a couple things. Rosh Hashanah will never be, there's a way that they remember this in the Talmud. Lo, Adu, Rosh. That's the words. Lo means no. Adu are three letters. Aleph, which means Sunday, because it's number 1. Daled, which means Wednesday. It's number 4. And Vav, which is number 6 in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Friday. Rosh Hashanah will never end up on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, meaning the first day. First day of Rosh Hashanah will never be on that day. And so these are because they fixed the calendar. And so therefore, I come back to this question, Chanukah is affected by the fixed calendar. And so we know Chanukah will never end up on a Tuesday because of that. So again, now I come back to the 3031. In 3031, it means that there was a leap year that pushed Hanukkah, and I'm going to explain that in a second. I know we've talked about it briefly, but I'll just touch it again. Because the Jewish calendar is 354 days, it's a lunar cycle, and the secular solar calendar is 365 days. Our Torah says that holidays have to be in seasons. Passover has to be in the spring. If I keep losing 11 days every single year, after 3 years, I'm a month earlier. And so Pesach, which let's say was in April, 3 years later is in March. And 3 years later is in February. And 3 years later is in January. And so because we can't have that, we have what we call a leap year, which is approximately every 3 years. I think it's 7 every 19 years. And that keeps on pushing things forward, fall back, push forward, fall back. And so now I come back to the year of 3030. 3030 has a year that the calendar gets pushed forward. And so when you come to December of 3030, you'd be celebrating Hanukkah that year. Kind of Hanukkah is before the leap year month. So that means Hanukkah was earlier, probably December 1st-ish. That year, they add a leap year. So when you come to 3031, Hanukkah now has been pushed to the end of December. It starts January 1st. So again, this was really about fixing our calendar to work for the biblical holidays. Now I will share, and this is the one thing that most people don't know, the fixed calendar was created, but they kept certain things. So this is actually known, but if you lived in Israel during the times of the non-fixed calendar, you got your message of when is the new month within 2 weeks. And so, meaning the furthest city in Israel knew by the 14th day of the month what day it was. Was it the 13th or the 14th? Right? Kind of, was it a 2-day or 1 day? Which meant that for Passover, which is celebrated on the 15th day of the month, and for, let's say, Sukkot, which is celebrated on the 15th day of the month, you already knew what day it was. And so you could celebrate a single day of the holiday because you didn't have to worry, is it a Monday or Tuesday, which would mean I would celebrate 2 days just in case. Right? If you lived out of Israel, you didn't get the message on time. And that is where you have 2-day holidays, even though the Bible, the Torah, gives a 1-day holiday. And this is where people get very upset. If you live in America today, we have a fixed calendar. So why should we be at the whims of this additional day when we now know what the day is? Right? The additional day made sense when you had to get a message, but now we have a fixed calendar. And so people don't like that. And the simple reason why we still have that system that we celebrate 2 days in the diaspora is a simple line in the Talmud that says, Minhag avotenu biadenu. We have the custom of our forefathers in our hands, meaning we're going to continue that custom. And a lot of people don't like that. It's like, wait a second, we don't need to keep that custom anymore. So why should we do that? And so I'll share that I don't have a great answer, but I have an answer that I have read, which talks to me, but not every answer talks to people. And that is, in Judaism, we talk about this idea that says, things are holy, right? And to receive holiness, it takes time to absorb. And so in Israel, the holiness, people were more sensitive to holiness because they lived in the Holy Land. So they only needed 1 day to absorb the holiness of a holiday. But in the diaspora, we're a little bit further removed from the Holy Land. We're not in the same sensitive kind of status. And so for us to take the blessings of the holiday and the holiness and the spiritual component of it, we need 2 days. Now, granted, that's an answer that gives some meaning, but some people don't like that because they look at it as an inconvenience to do 2 days of a holiday rather than 1.
I don't think it's inconvenient. I think for someone like you, who is holy, holy, holy,
I wish I could say that.
well,
Thank you.
as far as I know,
Okay.
you could do it in 1 day. I mean, why? Because I don't live in Israel, why is it making me less holy?
Well, so, okay, you're asking a different question. First, and I'll answer what you're asking. First thing is, if I lived in Israel, it'd be one day, right? It's not about me anymore. It's about the land, kind of. But again, that's not an answer. It's just a theory. There's no answer. The short answer is the rabbi said we're continuing the custom 2-day holidays in the diaspora, 1-day holiday in Israel. The only time in Israel that it is a 2-day holiday, Rosh Hashanah. Because even in Israel, in temple times, they celebrated 2 days, right? For a very practical reason. If the new moon comes out 1 a.m. in the morning, then you know that it's a 1-day holiday. But what happens if they wait and wait and wait, and it's only in the afternoon of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the potential first day, that they find out that it actually wasn't today. They find out in the evening it was tomorrow, right? So let's use a Sunday, Monday. Sunday is potentially the first day of the month if we see the moon. All day long they wait, but you have to celebrate it just in case. Because if they see that moon, let's say 4 in the afternoon, which is possible, then that day was the holiday and the next day is not, because it's a single day holiday in the Torah. Because they can't be sure, they have to celebrate that day. And it could be that they'll find out Sunday at midnight, which means I've celebrated an entire day just in case. And I find out now that Monday is the first day of the month, right? That's the potential that they were worried about because there was no time to adjust. Unlike a holiday that comes out 2 weeks later, we now know. But if it's on the holiday itself that you find out, we can't adjust. We can't get that message out. So everyone celebrated the first potential day just in case, which might end up being correct or not. And guess what? Let's say they found out on Sunday afternoon that it was the first day and it was correct. Maybe, half a country down, Israel, they don't get that message till the next day and they're celebrating a day and a half, right? By the time they find out, oh, today's not holiday. So they always celebrated 2 days.
Well, it doesn't give the women time to cook.
Oh, no, they prepare for 2 days. Yeah.
My understanding that the reason that June before couldn't be on a Friday or a Sunday is that Yom Kippur was Friday. You would be blowing the shofar on Shabbos or lighting the Shabbos candles before Yom Kippur was over, and on Sunday you would be doing a ballot on Yom Kippur.
So hold on. I understand what you're saying. I think it's slightly different than what you're saying, but same idea. So let's say Yom Kippur was on a Friday, which means it started Thursday night. Because Yom Kippur can be on a Saturday. So let's say it starts on a Thursday night. You can't really prepare for Shabbos because Yom Kippur is a holiday that you can't cook on. It's like a Shabbos. So you wouldn't be able to celebrate Shabbat properly. So that's probably one of the reasons. The shofar part is tricky because in temple times, the shofar was allowed in the temple. The only reason why we didn't blow the shofar on Shabbos was because they were afraid people would carry it, not because you can't blow the shofar. They were afraid people would do a different biblical prohibition.
Yeah.
No, that's the idea.
If Yom Kippur or on a Friday,
Meaning starting Thursday evening.
yes, then you wouldn't be able to light
Correct.
Shabbos candles
That's also correct.
because of Yom Kippur.
Because you can't use fire. Exactly. So that's another thing. But the Havdalah part is not an issue, and I'll explain. On a holiday that, let's say, is 2-day holiday, so it started Friday night, you go in, it's going to end on Sunday night. The Saturday night Kiddush, so when you do the blessing at your dinner, we'll also have a paragraph for Havdalah. Just to put out, they add a paragraph. In fact, there is an acronym how to remember the order of the Kiddush that night. It's called Yak Nahaz. Okay, Yud, Kuf, Nun, Hey, Zion, and this is how it goes: Yayin, which means wine, the blessing of Hagafen first. Kiddush, which is the paragraph of Kiddush. Ner, that you're going to say a blessing over the fire, because that's part of the Havdalah ceremony. Havdalah, we're going to do a paragraph about separation from the Holy Shabbos to another holy day, right? Because it's not weekday. And then Zman, which is Shehecheyanu. So you have this, because there was a debate, what should come first? So this is how they remembered. And this is, I just remember when I studied it, you remember, Yak Nahaz. But no, these are good questions. Coming to Hanukkah, though, obviously, we already know that if you have a menorah, and this is kind of on the same idea, if you're going to light menorah on Friday evening, it has to be before Shabbat candles, because you can't light fire after you accepted Shabbat, which is going back to what your point of Yom Kippur is, right? I can't light Shabbat candles if it's Yom Kippur. And so it's a specific order. First you light the Hanukkah menorah, then you light the Shabbat candles.
So it's interesting that when you said how they announced, you said torches fire. There was no blowing of the shofar.
That was, but that would be in Jerusalem. So meaning Jerusalem sanctifies it, there's a process for that. But afterwards, you have to get the message out. They didn't have secure email and like the quick messages we have. They needed people, horseback, walking, and torches. That was their method.
So people didn't blow shofar.
No, just the one. I mean, possibly, but the sanctification happened in Jerusalem. That's for sure where the shofar was. How they got it around in their own cities, that's a very good question. Meaning once, let's say we lived in Phoenix, once we got our message, how did we make sure everyone knew it? I don't think they blew the shofar because I was part of the sanctification, like in the Bet Din, but it's a good question. Maybe, was it like a siren or somebody running around knocking on people's windows? I don't know. I could look that up. That's a good question. I don't think they did that.
Like all the Revere.
Exactly. The British are coming, run through town with a horse. Yeah, so that is a good question though. Like, what was the system within a city once they got the message? I don't think I've ever read about that.
I asked you something that you really didn't know. How many?
It's not the first time. It's not the first time. While we're asking, I'm going to write this in. How did they share the new month within a city? Jewish. All right. But yeah, maybe. I'm sure I won't find the answer as quickly as I want because it's like a very unique, specific detail within it.
They said Shalom shouting through the city.
I would assume that. I'll find out. We'll check it out later. But at least I put the question in, so it'll be in my history. All right. Any other questions on that? So any other questions before we?
I'm gonna change holidays.
Sure, go for it.
Passover celebrates, one of the things it celebrates is our coming out of Egypt. So I happened to be on Netflix the other day and we watched.
The Exodus?
Which is, no, it's actually the Testament to Moses. It's a different take on it. But the question was asked and never answered is, why were the Jewish people allowed to be in Egypt for 400 years before Moses came?
Why were they allowed to?
Yes, why did God allow the Jewish people to remain slaves in Israel for 400 years?
First,
And I know there's no answer in the Torah, but what's the scholarly?
well, so there's two parts. First of all, it ends up being that we're not there for 400 in the end. We're there for 210, I think.
Okay, so 200.
But it was originally going to be 400. And what it says is that God already told Abraham that his children will be sojourners in the land of Egypt. So it was kind of prophesized. And Jacob eventually ends there, knowing that this is where the slavery is going to happen. But he was told to go there. So it's kind of, there's a catch-22 here. And part of the idea was Joseph ending up in Egypt was the beginning of this
Right.
sequence of events.
Why did God know?
Why did we have to suffer as slaves? I'm sure there.
And the same thing actually applies to the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust.
Right, that's what I was thinking as you asked the question. I'm like, there's not going to be an answer.
Yeah, I know there's no answer, but what do scholars say?
But it's impossible that Exodus happened the way it's described in the Torah. You couldn't have 2 million people, which is what they estimated would have been, because the Torah said there were 603,000 men of fighting age.
Right,
When you take those below fighting age and those over and all the women, the estimated would be 2 million people.
Right,
There's
2.4.
2 million people could have. But the Exodus lived in Sinai for 40 years. And none of the people who left, 2 million people, were able to go into Israel. They died in the Sinai. The fact that 2 million people died in the, there's a book out called Exodus Did It Really Happen? And if it did, how? And I can't remember the author's name, but his contention is that all the tribes left except the Levites. The Levites were the ones who actually left with the Exodus, and they didn't all go towards Israel. In fact, we were just in Morocco, and they had found evidence of Jewish communities that merged in with the Berber communities of Morocco. And Judaism was the first religion established in Morocco.
Okay, here's an answer. 210 years, not 220. Here are 3 reasons given. Number 1, to strengthen the Jews' trust in God. Right, you're at the whims of others. To develop a close relationship with God, so prayer, you have a reliance on. And number 3, to show the Jews the consequences of an overzealous pursuit of materialism. Those are 3 answers that this is from the sages. So I'm assuming some of it is in the
yeah, but why,
Talmud.
why 200 years, why not a generation or 2 generations?
Maybe we wouldn't get the message. I don't know. But I know that's when we become so large. Before that, this is kind of how I always share it. The first people that end up in Egypt are a family. They're not a nation. It was 12 tribes and their kids. But over 200 years, I mean, we know how large. If 600,000 males, like you were just saying, leave Egypt, which means we're not even factoring 200,000 males that are 20 to 60 is what we're talking about. So we're not talking about the 1 through 20 and 60 through 120, let's say. That's why they come up with this 2.4 million. Let's say there's an equal amount of women, so that's 1,200, and then you got to add and add and add. So that's kind of,
Yeah.
we became a nation there.
I'm just saying, if there is another answer.
I'll give you this article after. Just quick. It's a blog post on a website. Rabbi Lawrence Hajioff. Looks Sephardic. I'll share with you his essay. But yeah, it's still a good question. Like, we could ask that about a lot of things. Any other questions? All right, so I'll share a little bit about Chanukah. One of the lesser known details about Chanukah is that the original fight had nothing to do with killing Jews. So even though we know it as a war and a miraculous victory of a war, oil lasting for 8 days, not having enough or having enough for just 1 day, the question is, what was it all about? And what it was really all about was the Assyrian Greeks were trying to secularize the Jewish people. So it had nothing to do with, we want you all dead. It had to do with, we want you to stop believing in your God. And therefore, you would stop doing certain mitzvot based on that. So I'll explain. They had no issue with the mitzvot that were rational. So if you say don't steal, don't kill, they got that. They said, yeah, we get that. But if you say you have to do a circumcision at 8 days old, or keep Shabbat because God kept Shabbat, study Torah because it's a mitzvah to study God's Torah, those things they had I'm going to say they had an issue with. He said, what are you doing? If you don't get it and rationally it doesn't make sense, then why are you studying this? Why are you doing this? And so they had a large list of demands. With that came the service in the temple. And so the way they did this was they banned Torah study, they banned circumcision, they banned many things that fit into that kind of little circle. So the original reason for beginning the war was for religious freedom. It wasn't about being under someone else's rule. Now, there's a lot of history of who invited them, how did they come into our country in the first place. But the short detail, which is the most important detail about this holiday, is they wanted to remove God from the Jewish people. And so it ends up being a war because we know the Maccabees eventually, beginning with one little kind of fight, one little story, begins the revolt. And then that revolt becomes a rebellion, which becomes a miracle of the few destroying the many. We're going to get into that detail. And so this is the story of Chanukah in a nutshell. And so when we celebrate Chanukah, it's not about the oil as much as it is about the bigger picture. The oil is a nice part of the story, and a beautiful miracle, but it has so much more meaning to it. So I'm going to try to kind of do a quick rundown on that and then take, if you have questions or additional insight that we can talk about. So here is how I would begin. The miracle of the oil is a very important part of the miracle. We win the war. They come back to Jerusalem to put the service of the temple back in order. They clean out the temple. They remove all the idols, but the Greeks were very smart. They said, one of their big arguments was, you light a menorah in the temple, who cares what oil you use? The Jewish people were very particular. The oil that they used, in addition to being, of course, pure olive oil, was non-tampered, and they tampered with it. What does that mean? One of the basic laws in Judaism that was very important in temple times was the laws of ritual purity and impurity. You could not be in certain areas of the temple, and for sure the Temple Mount, if you were ritually impure. And so part of the service of the temple hinged on these laws, that anything that was ritually impure could not be part of the service. That is another example of a law that has no reason other than God said so. And so the Greeks, in their iterations of removing God because it made no sense to them, they said, these laws of purity make no sense. You don't see it. You can't touch it. It's like what I always share, the cooties, right? If you have kids who had the cooties, or if growing up you had the cooties, or you did that with your friends, it's a made up thing. You can't touch that. And that's kind of the laws of ritual purity. It's not something that's tangible. God said, this item makes you ritually impure, and this mikvah makes you ritually pure. It's beyond rational understanding. And so again, the Greeks had an issue with any mitzvah that we did because God said so. It has no rationale. Why do you do it? And so what did they do in the temple? If you want to light a menorah, why do you care what oil you have? Any oil that can light a flame, that can give fuel to a flame, should be fine. And so instead of destroying, this is where you start looking at kind of like some of the words. Instead of destroying the olive oil, they just removed the seal of the high priest, which meant the seal said that this is ritually pure and good for the service in the temple. They just removed the seal. They tampered with the bottle. So I have my water bottle. If I open this now and I crack the seal, if I bought this in a supermarket and it wasn't sealed, it says don't drink it. Does that mean someone put anything in here? No. But you want to be careful. And so it was the same thing with this oil. They didn't change the oil. They broke the seal because they were making a statement. If you're lighting a menorah, isn't it about light? But the thing is, the menorah in the temple was not about lights. It was about showing that God's presence rested in the temple. In fact, there were many chandeliers or menorahs in the temple, but there was one menorah that was meant to be lit by the priest, and it was a symbol that God's presence rests here in the temple. So much so that it says the temple was so bright that in a traditional older home, your windows, instead of being, I'm going to say, on a perfect kind of angle for light to come in, they had it a little bit with an angle so that the light would shine into the home, right? Because you didn't have lights. So you wanted to get as much light in from your windows. In the temple, they did it the other way around, that the light would shine out. So the temple, the menorah represented this idea of God's presence among the Jewish people. And so the Greeks, in their argument to the Jews, they tampered with the oil, saying, go light it. You don't need any special oil. Any oil will do. So when the Jewish people come back after they win the war, which is a miracle, they put the temple back into service. They want to light this menorah to show that we won, right? Put everything back into service. They can't find oil. They found plenty of oil. It's not like Jerusalem had no oil. They couldn't find oil that wasn't tampered with. They couldn't find oil that was ritually pure. And so what they did was they continued searching. And they finally find one small jug of oil, or a cruse, depending on what book you read, right, for the translations. They find just one that would last for one night. To replenish this oil, they need to get new supply. It came from a city that was about 8 days with sending a messenger there, producing the oil, and coming back. And so to do that, they don't know what to do. And so there is a very big debate of how the miracle of the oil happens. And some of the debate I kind of share is based on the way that if we were all in the same room and said, what do we do? We're not going to have oil for 8 days. We have one jug enough for one night. So there's 2 ways to do this, right? One is light them all up and do it right the first night. The other one is let's just ration it. Each night we'll add a little bit. And so what do? I have no clue. We know that the miracle is for 8 days. Why do I say I have no clue? I'll tell you. There's a question that is asked. What is the miracle of the first night of Chanukah? If you celebrate 8 days of Chanukah and they had oil for the first night, that's not a miracle. So we should only be lighting a menorah for 7 days, not 8, because the first night wasn't a miracle.
Well, it's a miracle that they found that one.
Okay, so there's a book with over 100 answers that tries to answer this question. Okay, so what is one of the answers? That the first day was the miracle of the victory of the war. In other words, what are we celebrating on night number 1? Either the miracle of the war, or the miracle of finding the oil, or if we go by that second opinion that I shared, which is that they rationed it out. Instead of filling up the cup, they put in enough for one, let's say, for 3 hours, right? If we do the math on that. And it lasts for 24 hours, then that would be a miracle too. So there are a lot of answers to this question, but clearly we see 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? That how did they light it? I don't know. Either it was a full cup and it lasted, or it was a little bit and it lasted for a full 24 hours. But either way, the first miracle of the oil was that the oil lasted for 8 days. However, that plays out. But there is something bigger in this story, and that is Jewish law says in times of war, if the majority of the Jewish people are ritually impure. Why? Because death would make someone ritually impure. So if we come into contact with someone with a dead body, for example, you become ritually impure.
I don't understand.
Well, so to come back to the ritually pure laws, what makes somebody ritually impure? One of the things would be coming into contact with a dead body, right? Why is that? Well, the body was very holy. It housed a part of God, the soul. When the soul leaves it, there's kind of like a vacuum, and that is impure. Why? I don't know, meaning I can't answer any laws of ritual purity and impurity because God said so. But basically, if you went to war, you automatically would become ritually impure. And so when the majority of the Jewish people are ritually impure, this is where it's a fascinating law. The service in the temple does not need to be done in a ritually pure state. Therefore, any oil would suffice. But the Jewish people said, no, we don't want to do it that way. Because if we do it that way, then the Greeks' message has still won, even after we won the war. they still have the winning message because look, you're using any oil. And so it was very important to them that they found oil that was ritually impure. And so the way I always kind of share this is God's return of the love was by making the miracle of the oil last for 8 days. So this is kind of how I always share about the miracle. It's much greater than just oil lasting. And the truth is the rabbis in the Talmud struggle and they say, wait, why are we celebrating this holiday? A lot of miracles have happened in Jewish history, but why are we making a holiday out of it? We don't always make a holiday out of every miracle. Winning a war, we've won many wars. That oil lasts longer than it should or does something wacky, we've had that too. It didn't become a holiday, but it was a bigger message going on here. And that was that the fight for God and for God's Torah and for God's message is what the Jewish people won. And so we celebrate the miracle because we won a war and the oil lasted for 8 days. But on its own, we've had many miracles like that. They don't become holidays. Here was a much greater message within this story. So because of that, I come to our modern day of celebrating Chanukah. Of course, we know it's a time for family, lighting the menorah and sharing the miracle is one of the great parts of the story, right? Pirsume Nisa, to spread the miracle of Chanukah, that perseverance in the fight for religious freedom, that there is a beautiful message within that the light shines bright. But there are a lot of messages within the story. One is the idea that we talk about, that in the public sphere, when we share this message, you have a couple messages. Number one is that religious freedom wins, right? Number two is the small overcome the great or the many, right? And in our own lifetime, we have a lot of messages that come through this. Number one is persevere. Yeah, we could be the small Jewish nation, but that doesn't make a difference if the truth is going to prevail. That's kind of the idea. And in our world right now, I think that message is very important, that the truth will prevail. If God is on your side, you have nothing to fear. Of course, it takes time to win the war, but the war will be won. But again, I think in our modern day, just having religious freedom is a very big deal. There are so many countries today that you can't worship openly. And so this was what the story of Hanukkah was. On that note, how do you celebrate it? So we light a menorah, sharing that message. We eat the foods that are made with oil to share the miracle of the oil. We give out Hanukkah gelts, which has slowly become Hanukkah presents. Now, why did they give out Hanukkah gelts? So here's the fascinating thing. For a generation plus, the Jewish people were persecuted in this war. Banned from studying Torah, which meant children were not studying it either. In order to win the war, it's not won if the next generation doesn't have a Jewish pride and a Jewish understanding of our purpose. And so to encourage study, parents gave money to their children to congratulate them, to tell them, you're studying so well, here is some money. I'm proud of you. So it wasn't about gifts the way we do it today. It was really about encouraging Torah study. That's the origin of Hanukkah gelts. It had nothing to do with competing with Christmas. It had everything to do with encouraging study and rewarding for study. I don't want to use the word bribery, right? There are two different ways to say the exact same thing. I can say, here's some money, study, right? That's bribery. Or I could say, you're studying so well, here's some money, I'm proud of you. It's like a little nuance and such a big difference. And so I encourage that even if you give gifts, you associate it with this idea that says, I'm so proud of who you are, the studies, etc., etc. In a Jewish way, we say, I'm proud that you're going to Sunday school, or whatever way you can share that message, rather than just, it's the Hanukkah, it's the season of giving, because that's not what it's about. It was really about if we won a war because Judaism and God were our cause and what we care about, then perpetuating that for the next generation was why they did Chanukah Gelt. Another thing is Chanukah Gelt was also about teaching about charity. So if I gave $1, you can teach your child, take 10 cents, put that in a pushka, put that in a charity box. So you're able to teach charity. Now, you can do that with gifts too, if that's what you're giving. But you have to be more, I'm going to say, focused on that message and say, hey, here's a gift. Please find a gift in your closet that you no longer use and bring it to whatever toy drive or whatever needy cause you can. So there are ways to do that, but that was really the message of Chanukah Gelt. Now, there was a very famous debate regarding the menorah, how to light the menorah. Do we start with 8 candles lit and lose a candle each day because there's one day less to the miracle? Or do we add a candle each night, which is what we do? And the reason why the win of that argument was add a candle was it says when you're doing something holy, when you're doing something good, you should always increase and not decrease. So that message is not just about the menorah lights, but that message is also in general in life. That is a beautiful message that says, do more good, don't do less good. So that is another thing of the menorah. The dreidel game, the origins of that are not necessarily as far back as the story of Chanukah. What we do know is that the Jewish children still studied, even though there was a threat of death. And the way that they would protect themselves was if they saw a Greek patrol, they would start playing. So put away their scrolls and pretend like they were just playing. So that's kind of where the dreidel came from. But I once looked this up. I think that the earliest kind of reference to the dreidel was maybe the 1500s or 1400s. So it's not from the story of Chanukah. What's another interesting thing? I brought this like Hanukkah guide that I had read, and there were some interesting facts. Here's something very interesting a lot of people don't know. After the brothers who win the war for the Jewish people, after they win the war, come back to the temple, they are priests. They are a priestly family. Kings in Judaism came from the Davidic dynasty. They should have come from King David. King David was not a priest. And so technically, after winning the war, they should have handed off the leadership of the Jewish people back to the kings, to the family of kings, and they didn't do that. And so it says that eventually they fight for the crown. Which brother, generations later, should be the king over the Jewish people, should be the ruler over the Jewish people. And this is a fascinating thing that I did not know. They are the ones who introduced the Romans into Judaism, into Judea. One of them asks the Romans to help them. And so when the Romans finally come in, actually, both of them ask the Romans, if I understand correctly. When the Romans finally come into Israel, that is the eventual destruction of the temple and the Jewish exile, which we are currently part of. So they are the ones, through an internal civil kind of fight, who introduce the future problems that we get. Now, eventually, Herod, which we know Herod very well, because the temple that we see today was kind of beautified by Herod. His stones are the ones that have the bevel. So anything that Herod built was with grandeur. So if you go to Hebron, which is where the Cave of the Patriarchs is, he rebuilt it to make it look beautiful. He was very into architecture and making things look great. Herod is the one who kills the last of the Hashmonaim family. That is the family of the Maccabees. I think maybe there was one girl left or something. There was a story about that, but technically their family was wiped out. So one of the things that they say is, why were they punished so brutally? Because they weren't in the right position anymore. They should have handed it off. Now we could say that in hindsight, obviously, but it is there's a lot of interesting parts of the Hanukkah story. A lot of people don't talk about this part. I'm sharing it because if I don't, someone can call me out on it. There was a civil Jewish war going on in the story of Hanukkah as well. A lot of Jews were influenced by the Greeks and were living a new lifestyle. And then you had the ones who said, no, we don't want the Greeks to influence our children. We don't want the Greeks. Think about it in any modern type of idea. And so there was pushback from within as well. Now, eventually everyone falls back into the Jewish living, but you had a period of time where Jews were not too happy with Jews. So I just share that as a side note. In the dynasty of the Hashmonaim, again, the Maccabee family, eventually you have, just like throughout our history, some kings were very good and Jews were living Jewishly very beautifully. Sometimes not. They had a queen that had a 12-year reign, and she uplifted the Torah scholars and kind of gave them their due respect that they can teach the Jewish people and live Jewishly. She was known as Shlom Tzion, if you ever heard of her. Again, there's some very fascinating things. So just to give you the timeline. So in the year 301 before the Common Era, so we're talking about 2,360 something years ago, that is when the Assyrian Greeks, or what we call the Hellenists in the story of Hanukkah, begin to influence the Jewish people. In the year 246 to 221, that's when the Jewish Hellenists gain power and influence. They use bribes to take over the high priest, which means that who are the high priests of the Jewish people? People who are not worthy. And there's a fascinating stories behind that every year a high priest would die. Why would they die? You pay for the position, but then on Yom Kippur, you got to go into the Holy of Holies, and you're not worthy. You died. It was a holy place that no one was supposed to be in. So much so that it says the high priest on Yom Kippur, when he would go in, this has nothing to do with this era, but throughout our history, he would go in with a rope connected to his foot, that if he would die, they had to pull him out, right? Because you can't go in. So again, some very fascinating things. The Assyrian Greeks in the year 198 they win over the Greeks and the Egyptians. And so now they are in charge of Israel. They now are the rulers over Israel. In the year 145, that's when Antiochus, or as we say, Antiochus, that is when he bans religious practices. So even though the Jewish people are already being influenced before that, it's almost 100 years later that he actually enacts laws that say you cannot live Jewishly. You can't do circumcision. You can't do Shabbats. You have to worship the Greek gods, do the Greek way of life. So he didn't allow study of Torah. He didn't allow holidays. He didn't allow circumcision, like I said, Shabbat. And if you were caught, you were punished by death. He also forced people to offer sacrifices to their gods. And this is where the story of the Maccabees begins. So in the year 140, there is a rebellion led by Matisyahu, who is the high priest, and his 5 sons, which one of those sons is Judah the Maccabee. They do say that one of the stories is that, I think it's Matisyahu himself, he sees that the Greeks are forcing a Jewish person to worship an idol, a pig or something, in a public space. He kills the soldier and says, whoever is for God, follow me. It's a very famous rallying cry. He dies a year later, the father of the Maccabees. And then it goes through Judah the Maccabee. Maccabee means, anyone know? Maccabee means hammer. There's Judah the hammer. But Maccabee also stands for 4 letters. Mem, Kaf, Bet, Yud, which is me, Kamocha, Ba'elim Hashem, who is like you in the ways of God, or among the mighty God. So that was their rallying cry in all their fights. Just going more through the timeline, Chanukah miracle one is literally that year that we win. But the war is not over, by the way. Even though we win the war and they come back to the temple, the war has continued to be fought. It's a year later that, because they're still, they still have to keep the Greeks out of their out of their land. In the year 138 is when the holiday of Hanukkah is celebrated. So it's a year later after the miracle. And again, it is because of the miracle of the war and because of the miracle of the oil. It's not only because of the miracle of the oil. In the year 138, the Greeks attack again. So even though we win the war and we're back in the temple, they're trying to gain their footing back over the Jewish people. And so that is where you talk about one of the Maccabees. I learned this as a kid, so I don't know what parts. I say as a kid, like these are the stories like you learn in like Hebrew school, that one of the Maccabees kills an elephant from underneath it, and the elephant collapses on him and he dies. So that is the year after Hanukkah. That's the year after we won the war. We're still fighting. So that was Elazar, one of the 5 brothers. But during that war, this is 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants. That was kind of the numbers of the Greeks. In the year 133, Judah the Maccabee is killed in battle. So again, what I'm trying to share here is a lot of us don't know the timeline. I say, I always knew Judah the Maccabee died at battle. It's after we're back in service in the temple. It's after Hanukkah has already become a holiday. We're still fighting. That's 5 years later. In the year 127, the last surviving Maccabee, his name is Shimon, is the leader of the Jewish people, and he becomes also the high priest. And then you have literally, I'm going to say 50 years later, that you have, by the way, I think around that year is when the war is kind of, I don't actually see what year it ends itself, kind of when the Greeks give up on that. But in the year, 50 years after kind of the last Maccabee takes over the place, that is when you have the highest point in the Maccabee or Hashmonaim era. And that is when I said this queen was ruling for 12 years. And again, she put the sages back at the top. In Judaism, you always had 2 rulers. You had like the prince and you had the Sanhedrin. You also had the king. So there's multiple people who people looked up to. And you had the high priest. During eras when when you want to assert your dominance and you're not doing the right thing, what's the first person you do? You shut down any dissidents. Like what happens in Syria, it happens in every country today, right? You get rid of the judges, you get rid of the leaders. That happened in Jewish history quite often. And then I said in the year 61 before the Common Era is when the civil war happens between 2 different siblings who bring in the Romans. And then 25 years later is when their era is ended by Herod. And when is the destruction of the temple? Not too far afterwards. So that is kind of the history of Hanukkah. Just on I'm going to read the question of the Talmud. I'll end on this point. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah? The only reference that you find in the Talmud is this question: why? What is Hanukkah? And here is the answer that they give. The sages taught on the 25th of Kislev begin the 8 days of Hanukkah, on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. It's very happy days. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein, and when the Hashmonaim dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they searched and found only 1 cruse of oil that lay with the seal of the high priest. It contained sufficient oil for 1 day's lighting only, yet a miracle occurred, and they lit the menorah with it for 8 days. The following year, they established these days as festival days with the recitation of Hallel, like what we do in the holiday service, and Thanksgiving. So that is basically the only kind of text in the Talmud about the holiday. Very short though. Why are we celebrating it? What was their question? Like, why is this a holiday? We've had other miracles. And this was their answer: war and oil. Our very interesting telling thing is when you read the prayer that we add on Chanukah, it really doesn't talk about the miracle of the oil. I could read it in English if you want to know. It's called the Al Hanisim prayer. This is the prayer we add in services for 8 days. Should I read it? In the days of Matisyahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hashmonaim and his sons, the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and to violate the decrees of your will. But you, in your abounding mercy, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended their rights, avenged the wrong done to them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and wanton sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with your Torah. You made a great and holy name for yourself in your world and effected a great deliverance and redemption for your people Israel to this very day. Then your children entered the shrine of your house, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, and kindled, I want to stress here the plural, and kindled lights in your holy courtyards, plural. And they instituted these 8 days of Hanukkah to give thanks and praise to your great name. That's not the menorah. It's menorahs. But the miracle is with one menorah. This prayer does not talk about the miracle of the menorah. It talks about the miracle of the war. Very interesting.
Well, but lights, plural,
Meant that we had a lot of candelabras there.
couldn't that be menorah?
It is.
In many
Over there it says Neirot. Let me see. I have a question on here. Oh no. That wasn't a question. It was just a message. So yeah, the question is, why doesn't it mention the miracle? Any last questions?
I want to go back when you're all done.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. You said that when you're, excuse me, in the presence of a dead body, you're no longer.
Pure, ritually pure.
How long? I was in the presence of my mother's dead body. Am I still?
Okay, so good question. Okay, very good question. I know that this could be a longer discussion too, but it also could be very simple answer because a lot of it is not things that we decide. It's just how the Torah put it. So the short answer is that the Torah says these are things that make you ritually impure. One of them is death. The thing is, in the modern world, we are all considered ritually impure because in those days, literally everywhere you went, you were cognizant. Did I touch something that could have been ritually pure? Am I under the same roof of a dead body, just going into a mortuary? And so as careful as we are, it's impossible to be careful enough. In temple times, if you became ritually impure, it meant you went to the mikveh at a certain time period, though. For a dead body, you'd wait 7 days. You would be sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer.
A red pepper?
No, red heifer.
Oh.
Right? It was a process that no one understood why. When they talk about what is a law that has absolutely no reason in the Torah, the paragon, the one that they point to is what's known as the para aduma, the red heifer. Why do I say it was so not understood? And we do it literally because God said so. Here's a fascinating part about the red heifer's ritual. The priest who would take the ashes of the red heifer that had been put on an altar and mix it with water and spritz it like that in the purification process, the priest became impure. But meanwhile, he purified you. Like, explain that. Exactly. So the idea behind it is this is what God said is the process of becoming purified, mikvah, and for a dead body, mikvah and the red heifer. And so even finding a red heifer was very uncommon. I think they say there were 7, a cow that had never seen a yoke, meaning it never worked a field. It had to be young and it had to have not a single other color on it. So it was fully red. If it had 2 hairs of its fur that were not red, it wasn't a red heifer. So that's why I'm saying there isn't a logical explanation. This was the process of the Jewish laws of impurity.
Gee, thanks for that answer.
So the short answer is you're still ritually impure, but maybe not because of that. Maybe you become ritually purified some other way. We just don't consider ourselves ritually pure. Now, there are people who are still more cognizant of that, and that is priests. If you're from a Kohen family, you typically don't go into a cemetery, right? Because that's a ritual impurity. They wouldn't be able to service in the temple. We don't have a temple today, but we still try to keep some of these laws. I will share something interesting. If you wash your hands for bread, that is because of ritual impurity. Why are we doing it if we don't have a temple? It was the way that the sages said, keep that in mind so that your mind thinks to the future, right? So it won't be so foreign and to be something we hope and pray for. So we wash our hands today for bread only because of the temple times.
Well, and to get rid of the germs.
That's an end. I always say those are the benefits of some of our traditions, but it's not why we do it. Right? Kosher might be more healthy, especially in the olden days, but we didn't eat kosher because of health. We ate kosher because God said so. It had a benefit. You washed your hands a lot. Your food was healthier, meaning the animal that they slaughtered had to not be a sick animal. That was part of the rules of Judaism.
For culture, are Chanukah are not biblical.
Okay,
Other than don't mix them.
Don't put them on the-
okay, so you have a very good question. When we're taught about the giving of the Torah, we're taught about an oral law and a written law. The Talmud is the oral law given to Moses at Sinai, eventually written down. That's how we look at the Talmud, which means that the laws of slaughter and kosher were given at Sinai. And even in the Torah itself, you find part of those laws not fully explained. The explanation was given orally. So to give you an example of that, the Torah says kosher meat must be slaughtered. It doesn't tell you how to slaughter. The Torah says it has to be slaughtered, but it doesn't say how. It does say in the manner that I will prescribe. Where is it told afterwards? It's not in a text. So Judaism, and this is, by the way, one of the great debates in Jewish history, was like, wait, this oral Torah, is it God's or not? It's a settled debate. If you do Judaism today, it is impossible to do Judaism without the oral Torah. But there are people who like to question it because those details are what make Judaism the details that people don't like. If I can say that the oral law is not from God, I can remove half of what we do today.
So who is it from?
It's from, well, Moses made it up. That would be the counter argument. Or the sages made it up. So this could be an entire, I have a 6-week course on that. I didn't create it. I'm saying that they teach about this. That kind of explains the system. But that is where people would counter. They'd say, wait, that's all man-made. If it's man-made, it made sense then. We're 3,000 years later. It makes no sense in the modern world. But again, you cannot understand the Torah if you don't believe in the oral law. One of them is the one I just shared about slaughter. Mezuzah, the way we put it up today, you need the oral law to know that. Or you wouldn't know how it looks. So I think that a lot of people today who question it don't even realize that everything they're doing on the Jewish actions that they do rely on this. And they're cherry picking. So that's kind of the way I answer that.
Well, if the Torah wasn't given till Sinai, how did it, before that, how did they know they were Jews?
First of all, who says they were Jews?
Aha.
They were the Israelites, right? They became a nation when they received the Torah. Till then, they were a family, a very big family. But the Jewish people became the Jewish people at Sinai. It's a very good question. There's a stronger question, which is that we see that in different places of the Torah, we see that our forefathers did do things, mitzvot, that weren't given yet. And it's like, how did they know it? One of the questions, where do I see, just to give you one question, then I'll turn off the recording after this. One of the famous questions on this is, when you look at Abraham giving food to the angels, it says he gave them cheese and milk, I think, butter, and he gave them tongue. Tongue. It was a delicacy. Say, how could, if he kept the Torah, this is the questions the commentaries ask. If he kept the Torah, how could he give them milk and meat? Why would we even ask the question if they didn't keep the Torah? Because it says the forefathers already kept the Torah. So like, how does that make sense? Right? One of the things it says is that Sarah, when she dies, Sarah is Abraham's wife. When she dies, how did they know that Isaac married a worthy young woman? Which is Rebecca. Because when she lit candles on Friday night, they lasted till the next Friday night. Just like her mother-in-law, who she never met. Right? That miracle came back into the tent. Why is she lighting Shabbat candles? So again, now they weren't mandated, so their mitzvot were different than ours. And I'll give you the classic example of that. When I make something Jewish today, like if I make a mezuzah and I write it in a scroll, it is holy. I cannot throw it out. The physical item has become holy, which is a fascinating idea that we introduced in Judaism, that you could take holiness and bring it down into earth. And when you talk about before the Torah was given, physical items didn't become holy. So even if I wrote tefillin, I could throw out the tefillin afterwards. They weren't holy. Holiness was separated. That was in the heavens. That's kind of how we describe the difference. But anyways, to go back to Chanukah in a nutshell, it is about meaningful Judaism, doing things because we cherish this love and connection of God. And the Jewish people were very particular to show that. And that was the miracle of the oil, right? We wanted to do it that way because that was where meaning was. That was because our connection to God. And the Greeks understood that and wanted to remove that from us.